Okay. I'm on? Okay, good. All right, welcome everybody. Glad you guys are here. Can everybody hear me okay? Yes. All right, so we are going to be going through the Intertestamental period. Yay! This is great. You guys are going to learn so much. I'll tell you a little quick story. After going through and teaching the Old Testament, what I actually went through and I was reading the Psalms without study helps. Basically, I've just taken a Bible without any study stuff, and I'm reading the Psalms, and for some reason, I'm like, I understood every one of them now. Because I understood, they were talking about coming, bringing in the sheaves and how God was going to re-bless them again, or coming back from captivity, or coming. And it's like amazing that you read this stuff and you really kind of like, that has to be in this time, which happens here, which happens here. It is amazing what you can do. And I'll tell you, this is what's going to happen when we go through this. So we've got a lot of work. So let me just pray and we can get going. Father, thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to do this, because it's just such a blessing that I can actually help people to understand this. Father, please open our hearts that we'd understand what you want us to see through this. In Jesus' name. So, Intertestamental period. Now, this is interesting. A lot of people, they just don't know about this period. And I kind of thought about, well, what is it like? Well, I like to try to give like examples of everything. So the intertestamental period is between about 430 BC and the time of Jesus, which we could say would be about, we'd say it's about 4 BC, but around, the turn of the millennia. And interesting because if we don't really know about it, it's kind of like we think about the United States, that they got here in the Mayflower in 1607, but yet the United States didn't start until 2007, 400 years later. So it's like all of a sudden all those 400 years didn't exist. But they did exist. And a lot of things happened during those 400 years. And that's what we're going to talk about, is those 400 years. We're going to go into a lot of things. Now, today's class is going to have a little bit more history to it, so I apologize for those people who are not a big fan of histories, but we have to go through this, because unless you understand what we're going to be talking about today, you're never going to understand exactly what the New Testament says. Okay, the New Testament has so many things that it's really weird. That's why, people like Martian in 130 AD said, well, the God of the Old Testament is not the same God as the God of the New Testament. Well, they're exactly the same. But because things are so different in the New Testament than we read in the Old Testament, a lot of people kind of say, well, this didn't happen, that didn't happen, or whatever. But it did. So let's get going. But we have to always do introduction to Christian history, because we're going to be doing the Christian history class. So let's talk about this. August 23rd, 1572, the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre. You're thinking, I never heard of a massacre. Well, it was. 30,000 people were killed. 30,000 Protestants, specifically Protestants. So what happened is that in this day, France, who was a Catholic nation who didn't like Protestants, the Protestant leaders were going to be there, and this particular family said, we don't like these guys, and they got the king to kill a bunch of them. Well, the killing just didn't stop. 30,000 people were killed, and during that time they were called Huguenots. That was the name. They were actually Protestant. But this was in a day that where you lived dictated what you were supposed to believe. So if you lived in France, you're a Catholic. Well, wait a minute, I'm Protestant. No, you're not. You're Catholic. But I'm Protestant. Not anymore. So the thing is that this would actually lead to the 30-year war, which we'll go into, was a devastating war. And I'll tell you what, you wouldn't believe about the 30-year war. I bet you never could imagine which king, out of all the countries in Europe, which king do you think led the 30-year war? Anybody? All the kings in Europe. Which country do you think led the 30-year war? France? Nope. England? Nope. Italy. Nope. Spain? Nope. Nope. Sweden. Sweden, yes, the king in Sweden actually led the whole thing and actually helped win the war. I know that you're like, no, I never thought of Sweden. Yeah, that was really weird. Actually, it was so funny. Back then, Sweden was so powerful, they took over Russia. Yeah, so there you go. That little history for you. Anyway, but it's no wonder that our early church fathers separated church and state, because the thing is, where you lived was what you were supposed to be. If you were living in, let's say, Germany, you were Protestant. If you were in France, you're Catholic. Anyway, so that's a little Christian history for you. All right, let's recap. So, if you were in my new Old Testament class, you went through all this, but remember, the Babylonian captivity, that's what brought everybody out. So Babylonian captivity happened. Nebuchadnezzar destroyed the temple. Now, do you remember how many different times did Nebuchadnezzar attack the city of Jerusalem? You guys remember? How many times? 3 times. Good job. 3 times. 605, 597, 586. But those are important dates because which prophet was taken away in 605? Daniel. Yes, Daniel was taken away. So, which we'll talk about him a lot during this class. Which prophet was taken away in 597? Ezekiel. Yes, good job. See how much you guys learn? So basically, God prophesied that they would be in captivity for 70 years. That was in Jeremiah 10. Of course, it happened, and they were returned under Cyrus the Great, which we talked about a few weeks ago. And that was predicted, his name specifically mentioned in Isaiah 10. The diaspora happened, and diaspora was dispersion. Now, this is important to remember, the dispersion, because that's going to set the stage for what we're going to be talking about the next 3 weeks. And that talked in Ezekiel. So the time we are talking about really is the intertestamental period. It's the most prolific period. The word prolific means that which a lot of think of a tree that bears tons and tons of fruit. We would call that tree a prolific tree. It produces a lot of stuff. And so during this period, the proliferation was huge, meaning they wrote a lot of things. So why do most Christians not know about it? Well, there's a couple reasons why. And the first reason is, dun-da-da, the Apocrypha. Some of you guys are going, what the heck is the Apocrypha? Well, some of you may have had some Catholic background, know exactly what I'm talking about. But the Apocrypha was a bunch of written information from the intertestamental period that was not the best information in the world. But the majority of our information we have about the intertestamental period comes from this. But the problem was, it was actually a bunch of religious texts, but they're kind of questionable at best. We'll go into those later because we got to go through that. Because let me tell you, the Apocrypha is one of the biggest problems Christianity had. If the Apocrypha wasn't there, we most likely wouldn't have gotten to weird stuff. So let's see detail. All right. So between the 17th and 19th century, the Apocrypha was in the King James Bible. It was there, always there. But we got rid of it, the Protestants got rid of it, and one of the reasons why is because it talked about doctrinal issues like praying for the dead and purgatory, which is, if you're from a Catholic background, know exactly what I'm talking about. Those are really bad issues that really sent Christianity going that direction. So but it's a great text for us if you want to learn about this period to read some of these books. But we will go through that actually starting next week. So we'll go through some of that next week. But this was and all of these books were written during the intertestamental period. Any questions so far? Okay. All right. But the thing is, since they took that away, it's out of sight, out of mind. No one thinks about it. So we assume that nothing happened. But we got to remember, the Apocrypha was there, and it had some good information, just not quite good godly information, but it has good historical information. So if you ever want to read some of these books, like the Book of the Maccabees and stuff like that, don't take your doctrine from it, but it has some good history in it. All right, in this class, we're mainly going to focus on information that helps you to understand the Gospels and New Testament. That's my goal, not to teach you history, not to make you full of knowledge, but to help you to understand the New Testament. Because in the New Testament, all of a sudden we go through the Old Testament and you don't read about Pharisees, Sadducees, you don't read about synagogues, you don't read about like what we're going to talk about, the oral Torah versus the written Torah. You don't read about any of that. All of a sudden we get to the New Testament and you see all these problems with Jesus confronting the Pharisees and Sadducees and doing all these things. And we're like, what the heck? But that's what we're going to talk about, is how we got there. And I promise you, after the end of this class, your knowledge will be great and you will really, really understand why the New Testament was written in Greek, why it wasn't written in Latin. Okay, you're going to understand who the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the synagogues, why they paid taxes. There were some issues with taxes, about coins, different things like that. All right, but first we've got to go through this. Now, this is going to be my challenge for everybody. What I would like everybody to do is to read Daniel chapter 2, 7, 10 through 12. And the reason is that Daniel, his prophecies were perfect. They were actually quite amazing. Because the thing is, especially when we go to 10 through 12, and they're talking about the Ptolemaic and Seleucid wars. It's amazing and how accurate it was. Now, we're not going to go through absolutely everything it goes into, because those are long chapters and it goes into a lot of detail. We're not going to get into that much detail, but I promise you, if you read these, you will understand what God is setting the stage for. Basically what that is first of all, 2 and 7 basically talk about the next 600 years of existence. God prophesies of what people are going to come and going to take over. And it was exactly right. I mean, it's kind of hard to say that there are going to be 4 major powers going to take over, but that's exactly what happened. And we'll get into that. So here's kind of when you look at Daniel 2 and 7, here's kind of what they're talking about. So Daniel 2 and 7 basically talks first about the Babylonian period. And it's good to know dates. Only reason why is because then it kind of gives you context. So the Babylonian period was between 612 and 540, Nebuchadnezzar. They didn't last long. Remember, they got defeated, and they got defeated by these guys, the Persians. The Persians lasted till 330, and they were defeated by these guys, which is the Greco-Macedonian people. We'll get to those guys starting today. Then Rome came in, and then there's another one. They talk about the different areas here, the divided Rome, and the last one was basically, this is what I believe it is. The fifth one is the Roman Byzantium Empire, because they talked about the divided. You may not have heard of those guys. We're not going to go into this stuff right here, but I'm just adding it on just to show you. But I believe that the last one they're talking about is Roman Byzantium empires, because that's specifically dealing with the Middle East. But some scholars believe it was the Holy Roman Empire. Now, the interesting thing about the Holy Roman Empire, and this is the big joke of historians, it was neither holy, nor was it Roman, and it wasn't an empire. But let me tell you, all your textbooks have Holy Roman Empire on it. They really weren't. Because, by the way, the Holy Roman Empire was actually in Germany. So it wasn't really in Italy. So I don't know where they're getting that from. But I'm just saying, and also just remember that my PowerPoint will be available to you guys also. So if you want, and remember, any PowerPoint you want, send me a text. I'll send it to you. You can have anything you want. As much as you want. I don't care. You can take them all you want. So if you want to go through this again on your own, which is not a bad idea, you can have it. All right. So Daniel 10, 11, and 12 basically talks about the Greco-Macedonian Empire. We will spend the majority of our time on this empire because this is where we see things like Hanukkah, all the writings that shaped the Jews into where we see them when Jesus comes. And the thing about this is it's surprisingly accurate, not only just accurate, but very descriptive. We're not going to go into all of it, but what you may want to do if you're really interested in that time frame is read Josephus. Because Josephus, and there's also a good website out there if you want to learn about this time called jewishhistory.org, jewishhistory1word.org, and it's actually written by a Jew. But it's very, very interesting information. All right. All right, so let's start from the beginning. So, King Xerxes, that dude, that's the dude that married Esther. So King Xerxes is the guy, remember we talked about him, there was Cyrus the Great, there were Cambyses, Darius the Great, and then King Xerxes. So Xerxes is the guy who married Esther from the book of Esther, but he did some really, really stupid things. First of all, he spent way more than he should have, his government. I know, is it me or does something sound familiar there about spending way more than you should and blowing money on stuff? We're like going, why would he do that? But he was very bad with money. And it's kind of set the Persians up to fall. And also, not only that, he went to war with Greece. And that's going to be important. We're going to talk about that next. Because going to war with Greece is going to set up something. Now, one thing I want to tell you right now, that all the things we're going to talk about sets the stage. One thing sets the stage for the next, which sets the stage for the next. And it's important to understand this because if these things wouldn't have happened, Jesus would not have been able to come. All these things sets the stage for Jesus coming. And it's important that things are set up the way they are. And what's going to be amazing with this, when Jesus comes, we're going to see that everybody spoke one main language. People were dispersed all over the place so that all of a sudden the gospel can be transmitted everywhere. Okay, people were under one government so that for the most part, wherever you traveled you're pretty safe because you're under one government. That would be the Romans. So all of these things, let me tell you, Christianity, if all those things weren't there, in that little backwater hole of a place called Judah in Jerusalem, nothing would have happened if all this stuff wouldn't have happened. So that's where we're going to get into it. So let's talk about the Greco-Persian Wars. Now, you're going, what the heck happened there? But you guys know about this. Trust me. First one was the Battle of Marathon. The other one was the Battle of Thermopylae. Now, the Battle of Marathon is that cool guy that ran 26.2 miles to get something taken care of. Now, that's where we're getting the word marathon. Yes, ma'am? Okay. That's where we get the marathon from. The Battle of Marathon was a Persian, we're supposed to be a Persian victory, but it was a Greek victory. What happened was the Greeks were really afraid of the Persians because what the Persians would do is they would kill you or they would take you captive and women and children are going somewhere else in exile. So what Athens, Greece in Athens, did is they said, we're going to kill ourselves to not become Persian slaves. That's what they were supposed to do if the Greeks didn't win. But the Greeks did win, and the guy ran 26.2 miles. So his name was Phidippides. He ran 26.2 miles to stop the suicides. He did. That's why he did it, because they were going to kill themselves. So he basically, now this is interesting, this is from historian Herodotus, says, the words on arrival were, joy to you, we've won. Now his next word probably were, my feet are killing me. And he died, and he really did. And his feet were all bloody, yeah, he died. It was a bad, yeah. But the thing is, got to remember, these guys ran barefoot. They ran barefoot. And he wasn't just running like his nice little smooth Boston streets. He was running hills, mountains, everything else. So, all right. The next one, guys should probably know from the movie 300, the Battle of Thermopylae. So that was the next one, and that's where these guys got together, and they actually stood up against the Persians, and the Greeks won the battles. And that's important to understand. The Greeks won these battles, but it was at a high cost. Okay? So what happened is that after they won, they went, guess what they did? We can't get along with each other. They went and they had a civil war. The Greeks did. They fought against each other. Imagine that. Let's not get along with each other. So Athens and Sparta started warring, and this set the stage. So now we have Xerxes blowing money, wars with Greece. Now Greece don't get along, and they all fought. Persia's weak because of the wars with Greece. The Greeks were weak because they had a big civil war, and we have somebody else coming. Our next guy comes on the stage, and his name was Philip of Macedon. He was Macedonian. Macedonia is right above Greece even today. Do not call a Macedonian Greek because they get mad at you. So, Macedonia were basically, because Greek was in civil war, Macedon started taking over. They were very uncivilized, and they were not very smart people, and Philip of Macedon knew that. But this is important. Now, please pay attention, because this will set things up for something completely changing that's going to set Christianity up. He got his son together with this dude. Probably heard of him, Aristotle. Aristotle was a philosopher, or as Bill and Ted would say, philosophize, dude. So when he got together with Aristotle, his son was trained by Aristotle. That's going to be important, because it's going to change everything. So let's go back.
John.
Yes, ma'am.
Sorry, what was the son's name?
I'm getting to that in just a minute. I'm setting the stage, you guys. What do you think the son's name was?
Alexander.
Oh, you're going to get it right. Yes, his name is going to be Alexander. So Aristotle was one of the greatest influencers in history. A lot of our government system is because of Aristotle and Socrates, or as Bill and Ted would call him, Socrates. Hey, dude, it's under Socrates, man. So, you guys remember that movie? I love that movie. So, but the thing is, one thing about Aristotle that's interesting, though, is that Aristotle, even though most Greeks thought about the pantheon, the Greek gods, that's not the way Aristotle taught. This is going to be important. Aristotle didn't teach of these guys. He taught about a single God. A single God. So that's why they kind of call him a monotheist. That is important. So, but before we get there, the other thing is, he wanted to teach him about Greek history. They were not Greek. These guys were not Greek. They were Macedonian, but they took on the Greek persona. And that Greek persona is Hellenism. And I wanted to say this Hellenism basically it's like the whole idea of the Greek culture. This is going to be important, because this is going to change the Judeans forever. This culture is going to change Judah, Egypt, Babylon, Rome, us. No other cultural philosophy did more to shape the Jews in the early Christian church than Hellenism, the Greek ideas. So let's take a look at this. This comes from the New Testament. John 2:12. Now there were those Greeks. Wait a minute. In John 2:12, the Romans were in charge, right? Well, why are they calling them Greeks? Well, they did. Now the Greeks that went up to worship festival, they came to Philip. Notice Philip is the same name of the big guy that we just talked about. A lot of people were named Philip because they liked these guys. Okay? So let's look at that work. What is that Greek word? Some of the Greeks, the word for that in the New Testament is Helen. Hellenism. We even use it in the Bible, Hellenism. Here's another one in Acts 11:20. Some of them went to Cyprus and Cyrene and Antioch and began to speak to Greeks. The word for Greeks, Hellenistes. Hellenism was so big and so important. Now you got to remember, we're talking 300 years. This was 300 years prior to that. And they're still using it. This is probably what? 45 BC, 45 AD. So almost 350 years later, they're still using the same words. Hellenism. That's why it's important. But the guy we're talking about is this dude. Yes, Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great was the guy who changed it all. He was the guy who changed it all. So, we talked about Hellenism. Alexander the Great would shape the culture and language of the Middle East for 600 years. I mean, who do you know has that much power who can shape things for 600 years? That's a lot. So these guys, he would come in there, and even though they became Rome and they spoke Latin, guess what? They were still shaped by this guy. So basically, God chose the next leader very wisely. For per Josephus, Alexander came to Judah. So what happened, Alexander, if you guys know about a little bit of the history, Alexander defeated everybody. His armies went through and just wiped out all the Middle East, and wiped out Egypt, and wiped out part of Europe. He wiped out India. It was like within about 10-year period. But, as Josephus says, when he came to Judah, the high priest got off his horse, and that was it. Basically, the horse was his trademark. When everybody says, so you always see the horse, the big thing, he was a big horse. He actually got off his horse and he bowed down to the high priest in Judah. The guy who just wiped out all of the Middle East, because what happened was that supposedly he had a vision, and when Alexander had this vision, he saw the high priest's face. Now, if you are a conqueror and you're conquering the whole entire Middle East, India, Egypt, why would you care about some little backwater town called Jerusalem? But what he did is he got off his horse, bowed down to him, the high priest, Alexander the Great, the big guy. And what would happen is Jews now found favor with him. Instead of going and destroying him, if you guys remember the Old Testament class, how they destroyed the Babylonians and the Syrians, they destroyed everything. He saved them. And one of the reasons why he saved them is because the Jews were monotheists. Alexander the Great was a monotheist. Thank you, Aristotle. See where God's coming here? See how important this is? Yes, sir.
What's so amazing about this, and I know this is the picture you're painting, is like when you look at the passage in the New Testament that talks about when the fullness of time had come, mm-hmm. God is orchestrating all of this.
Absolutely.
Behind the scenes during this 400-year period.
Uh-huh.
He's moving all the players on the board to bring about the perfect scenario.
It was,
yeah,
that's my whole, yes.
In a very narrow window of history.
Very narrow.
To set the perfect stage for the coming of Christ.
Absolutely.
And for that story to then be taken to the whole world.
That's exactly right. Thank you. I'm actually glad you guys have got the idea what I'm trying to portray here. Very good. Thank you, Paul. You got the idea. God is setting the stage for Jesus to come, and he's giving the Jews favor. Now, let's just say the Jews aren't going to always have favor here, but there, for the most part, God is keeping them going.
Where did Aristotle come up with the idea of a monotheist?
It wasn't completely monotheist as we think, but he believed in one central being. It's more of a force, more of an idea, and sadly, we're going to see that the people who kind of grabbed a hold of Aristotle's, I'm going to give you a little hint. There's a little foreshadow into next week, but the guys who kind of grabbed a hold of Aristotle's were the Sadducees, which was going to be bad because they don't believe in an afterlife. They don't believe in this. So yeah, we're going to talk about the Sadducees. But any other questions? All right. Alexander would go on to defeat Egypt, the Persians, all the Middle East. He did so over 10 years, and he died. I think he was like 33 when he died. Really bad. So he died, and he split it into 4 parts. He split his kingdom into 4 parts. The generals, there were 4 of them, but we're going to focus on 2 of them. Okay, and again, this is important because these 2 guys are going to shape the next 250 years. And that's going to be the Seleucids and the Ptolemies empires. We're going to go more into them a little bit later, next week actually. But is everybody, I'm not boring anybody, is this interesting, everybody? Okay, good. Good. I just hope you guys understand how important this setting the stage up here. All right. But let's go back to Hellenism. So Hellenism is basically the Greek culture, okay? And the ethos came from the myth of Helen of Troy. You've probably heard of her, Helen of Troy. If you didn't, you may have taken humanities in high school or college and read the Odyssey and Iliad, which from Homer, that was basically, he talked about Helen of Troy. We don't even know if she really existed. Okay, we don't even know if she really existed. Most likely she didn't. But the thing is, people believed her just kind of like George Washington, Abraham Lincoln is to America. The founding fathers. I mean, who do you think great leaders, great presidents? George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, right? So that was Hellenism to Greece. So Greece thought of Hellenism and they just loved the Hellenistic ideas. Now, the interesting thing about this is even though Alexander the Great was not he really wasn't Greek. It's kind of like, think about it. Hitler wasn't German. You probably didn't know that. But yes, Hitler was Austrian, but he took on the persona and everything became German. Same with Alexander the Great. He took on the Greek ideas, the Greek culture, the Greek ethos, everything. So this whole idea, all this ideas and everything, which came from Aristotle. Because Aristotle's the one who gave it to him. So Athenian Greeks were democratic. Okay? So now, granted, we're not going to say they were that democratic, because only if you were free and you were male could you vote. Not everybody could vote, but at least they had something towards it, kind of towards it. So, but what it is because of that, we actually take a lot of our government history from the Greeks. The ideas of how we do a democratic government actually comes from the Athenians. Spartans, well, that were a little bit different. This is important because the Spartans gave us the Olympics, all right? And the problem is they always did so in the nude. Now, keep that in mind. That's going to set up for Hanukkah. You're like, what the heck does Greeks in the nude have anything to do with Hanukkah? Well, it does, actually. It does. Trust me on this. Trust me on this. You're like, what the heck? Greek nudes, Hanukkah, they don't really go together. And I bet if you go to a Jew and say, what about those Greek nudes? They probably wouldn't know what you're talking about. But they did have a big influence in Hanukkah. So the Greeks influenced beyond the Middle East. They influenced sports. They do. We have Olympics. Language, the Greek language, which basically was the Old Testament was written in Greek. The culture, okay, customs, government, philosophy, architecture. If you look at the White House, this is Greek architecture. Okay? That's Greek architecture, specifically from the time we're talking about. But it's also important to understand that influence had a really bad side to it. It's thought that greater than 40% of the Jews turn to Greek way of thinking. That's going to be important next week when we get into Hanukkah and stuff like that, because it's kind of like today. You know, we have the new culture today, the new embracing of alternate lifestyles. It's kind of came into the church, and many in the church have grabbed a hold of it and said, we're running with this. It was the same thing with the Jews. The Jews said, oh, we love this Greek culture, we're running with it. And it's going to set a really bad thing happening. All right, it would influence many Sadducees, which we'll go into later. All right, Greek philosophers. They basically influence how we study the Bible. You probably didn't know that, but the way we study the Bible is based upon the Greek ideas of how to look, how to think, how to use logic, how to, set up the different ways. So, and actually this came about, and we need to thank the Catholics for this. They're the ones who brought the guys in from Byzantium to teach it in the 1500s after the fall of Byzantium, and Neoplatonism, Neo-Aristotelianism, all this stuff came in, and that is why we study and we look at things the way we do, is because of these guys. So I'm telling you, these guys are pretty famous, what they did. Oh, and then we have Socrates. Hey, Socrates, dude. All right. I love that movie. I was actually going to show a clip from that movie, but I thought, I don't have time. So, all right. Oh, good. We have plenty of time. So, let's talk about the tax system under Alexander the Great. Now, the tax system was not a good system, but, they've been doing it. So, basically, here's the thing. Let's say Macedonia comes in here and comes into Judah and says, guess what? We're in charge. You're paying us taxes. You think you'd be happy about that? No. So, but let's talk about this. Matthew 9 through 11. As Jesus went on from there, he saw a man named Matthew sitting in a tax collector's booth. Follow me, he told him. And Matthew got up and followed him. While Jesus was having dinner at Matthew's house, many tax collectors and sinners came with him and his disciples. When the Pharisees saw this, they said, why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners? Okay, why were tax collectors hated so much? It's all because of this time frame. Think of it like the colonists were angry at Britain. Taxation without representation. That was our big thing. Now, granted, ours wasn't as bad as what they had it, but for the most part, they didn't like paying taxes to people that they had no stake in. However, their issue went way beyond that. All tax paid to a foreign power. Remember, they were doing this for 500 years. They didn't like it. I wouldn't like it. It's kind of like China takes us over and we pay China taxes. I wouldn't like that. Not only was the tax collectors who collected they were notoriously corrupt. They would increase the tax to make themselves money. The tax collectors would increase the tax to make themselves money. But if you went through my class on the law, it's kind of like, there's an app for that. No, there's a law for that. And that law was this guy. Deuteronomy 23. Do not charge a fellow Israelite interest, whether on money or food or anything else they may earn interest. You may charge a foreigner interest, but not the fellow Israelite. So the Lord may bless you. Basically, don't try to make money off your brothers. And that's what they were doing. And so the Pharisees were angry, and rightfully so. They were angry. However, God's attitude towards sinners. And again, I want to take everything from the Old Testament because it helps us to understand that this is what God thought prior to even Jesus coming. Okay? No one who conceals transgressions will prosper, but one who confesses and forsakes them will obtain mercy. It sounds like that's what Matthew and his friends did. Therefore, the Lord waits to be gracious to you. Therefore, he will rise up and show mercy to you. For the Lord is a God of justice. Blessed are those who wait for him. But remember, that's exactly what those guys did. They followed Jesus. Jesus was trying to teach them. Jesus wanted them to turn away to save them. Okay? So we hated they hated these people, and rightfully they were breaking the law by doing what they're doing, but what Jesus was doing was also correct. Okay? Jesus was acting in his, that is God's, character. He was literally doing just like they talked about. But let's talk about one other issue. Paying taxes through coins. They came to him and said, "Teacher, we know you are a man of integrity. You are swayed by no others." I don't know if you figured that out, but that's a pretty nasty thing to say, because the teachers of the law are saying, you don't listen to anybody, not swayed by anybody but yourself. I mean, they're kind of nasty. So, because you pay no attention to who they are. Basically, you don't care who's in charge. That's what they're saying. But you teach the way of God in accordance to the truth. Is it right to pay the imperial tax to Caesar or not? Should we pay or shouldn't we? Okay? Now, the big thing is, the idea was not really the tax per se. What it was is they didn't like the idea of Caesar or anybody else being on the coin. They didn't like that. But we read on. Jesus, why are you trying to trap me? Bring me a denarius. Let me look at it. They brought him the coin. He said, whose image is on this inscription? Caesar's, they replied. Jesus says, give to Caesar what's Caesar's, and give to God what's God's. By the way, this is a Caesar denarius, by the way. That's what it actually looked like. This was a Caesar denarius and actually came from 42, which is exactly the same coin Jesus actually we're talking about. But the thing is, they were already paying taxes for hundreds and hundreds of years. So it had nothing to do with taxes. They just did not like the idea of the guy's face on the coin. For 800 years they were paying taxes. So unlike the problem with tax collectors, though, is this was hypocrisy. Because I don't want to pay him because I don't like his face. And it really was about his face being on the coin. It was about that. And, I'll be honest, where I learned this issue came from that Jewish website. The Jews said, the Jews hated the idea of paying anybody with someone else's face on it. But the thing is, they were paying taxes, and to be honest, they actually, during Israel's time, they had coins with the king's face on it. When they were in their own land and under their own government. They were using coins then. It was hypocrisy. So this is why and I want to show you the difference, because Jesus never said anything to, when it came to the tax collectors, Jesus explained why he was doing this. When it came to this, these guys are just being hypocrites, saying, well, I don't want to pay anything because the guy's face is on it. It was just hypocrisy. They were doing it for 800 years. What's the big deal? And that's why Jesus got upset. So I really wanted to understand that, because these are ideas, these things came about during the intertestamental period. And that's it for today. So these came about during the intertestamental period. Next week, sorry, I know I went through that pretty quick. Next week, we're going to go into Seleucid and Ptolemaic. Okay, we're going to talk about the culture of Osiris, where the Ptolemaics married their sisters. We're going to talk about Hanukkah. We're going to talk about the Pharisees, the Sadducees. We're going to talk about the oral Torah. So all the meat is going to come next week. Do you have any questions? Yes, sir.
Just a thought on the whole coin thing. You know, Jesus said, render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar. Caesar's image was on the coin, and render kind of means you're paying back a debt.
Mm-hmm.
But to God, so Caesar's image is on the coin. God's image is on the Christian.
Right.
And so we are to render, we have a debt to him, and so we're to render ourselves to him as opposed to any earthly.
And that's exactly right. And the thing is, though they're paying taxes, in the sense, whatever. You just do what you got to do. We don't like it. You got to do what you got to do. So, any other questions?
Great stuff.
Any statement? Okay. I hope you learned something. I'm sorry if it was a little dry, but next week we got a lot of stuff to go through, and we are, oh my gosh, right on time. Yes! All right, guys. Thank you so much.